In the fall of 1992, Dale Hoffman pulled his 18-wheeler into a Texaco off Route 287. He was a steady man, a husband and a father, with a load of machine parts bound for Dallas. He bought a cup of coffee, exchanged a few words with the clerk, and then climbed back into his Peterbilt. 20 minutes later, he rolled out of the lot and disappeared into the night. No accident was reported, no wreckage was ever found, and no body turned up. At first, police combed the highways and back roads, chasing down every rumor. Neighbors whispered that Dale might have run away with another woman. Others suggested he simply walked away from the pressures of his life. 8 long months later, with no sign of him, the case went cold. His wife was left with silence and suspicion, and his young daughter grew up believing her father had chosen to leave. The insurance company finally declared him legally gone, paying out $700,000. But for 2 decades, one question haunted his family and his hometown. What really happened to Dale Hoffman on that November night? The truth, buried deep and silent, was waiting to be uncovered. For nearly 2 decades, the Hoffman family lived with nothing but silence. Dale's truck had vanished off the face of the earth, his name reduced to a cold file tucked in the back of a sheriff's office cabinet. But in 2012, everything changed. A construction crew was expanding operations at an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town when one of the bulldozers scraped against rusted metal. At first, the workers thought it was just junk buried beneath the limestone. But as more rock was cleared, a shape began to emerge. The cab of a long-haul truck, its once red paint now faded into a dull brown, half swallowed by stone and time. Inside that cab, investigators found what the Hoffmans had feared but never been able to prove: the skeletal remains of Dale Hoffman still strapped into the driver's seat. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every detail. There were no signs of a crash, no evidence of a roll or impact. Instead, a single, chilling discovery stood out: a small bullet hole at the base of his skull. Dale had not disappeared on his own, nor had he driven off the road by accident. He had been executed. The evidence didn't stop there. On the passenger side of the cab, investigators recovered a receipt, remarkably preserved in the dry, sealed environment of the quarry. It was from a diner just outside Amarillo, time-stamped the night Dale vanished. The slip showed 2 cups of coffee and 2 sandwiches. More than one person had been in that truck. That simple piece of paper shifted the story completely. Dale had not been alone when his life ended. Whoever sat beside him that night knew him, shared a meal with him, and then pulled the trigger. When news reached the Hoffman family, the impact was devastating. Emma, now in her 30s with children of her own, had lived her entire adult life believing her father had chosen to walk away. She had built her identity around that wound: resentment, abandonment, a quiet shame she never spoke aloud. The revelation that he had been murdered, that he had never left her by choice, shattered and healed her all at once. She wept not just for the loss of her father, but for the 20 years stolen from her by a lie. Her mother, too, was forced to relive the nights of doubt, the sideways glances from neighbors, the whispered suspicions that she had driven him away. For the community, the discovery reopened an old scar. A mystery that had hung in the air like fog now had an answer, but that answer carried a darker weight than most could bear. Dale Hoffman hadn't simply vanished, he had been silenced. And the fact that his killer had managed to hide him in plain sight, encased in stone for 2 decades, suggested something much larger and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The quarry gave up its secret, but the truth it revealed was only the beginning. When the sheriff's office called the Hoffman family in to identify what had been found in the quarry, Emma sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes before walking inside. For most of her life, she had carried the belief that her father had chosen to leave her. She was only a child when Dale disappeared, but the absence hardened into something she lived with: daily resentment, shame, and the unspoken ache of abandonment. Now, the truth was here, and it was messier than she could have imagined. Her father hadn't left her behind. He had been stolen from her. Standing in the sterile hallway of the county morgue, Emma felt the weight of 2 decades pressed down on her chest. The medical examiner gently pulled back the sheet, revealing the fragile remains that were once the man she had longed for and hated in equal measure. It wasn't the face she remembered, it was bone and shadow, but the ring on his finger, dull with age, confirmed what her heart already knew. Dale was home, though in a way she never wanted. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered a quiet apology, as if somehow she could rewrite the years of anger she had carried against him. For her mother, Linda, the moment was equally shattering. She had built a life after Dale's disappearance, eventually remarrying, yet never truly escaping the whispers of neighbors or the sting of unanswered questions. To many, she was the wife who drove her husband away, the woman who collected on a life insurance policy while quietly moving forward. Seeing Dale's body for the first time after 20 years unraveled her carefully constructed reality. Her shoulders trembled as she clutched Emma's hand, her new husband standing silently behind them, unsure how to bridge the past and present. The morgue was quiet, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. No one spoke for what felt like hours. Emma's mind raced through childhood memories, the way her father's hands dwarfed the steering wheel of his truck, the way his boots thudded across the porch steps. She thought of the birthdays he had missed, the graduations, the grandchildren he would never meet. Every milestone of her life was now colored by a single fact. He had not left by choice. He had been murdered, discarded like a secret no one wanted uncovered. For Linda, grief was complicated by guilt. She had doubted Dale, even allowed herself to believe he might have run away with someone else. That belief had shielded her from despair, but also poisoned the way she spoke about him to Emma. Now, faced with the truth, she could no longer protect herself with lies. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, whispering his name over and over, as though she could call him back. The discovery in that cold, clinical room reshaped the Hoffman family forever. Grief, anger, and relief tangled into a single, unbearable knot. They had finally found Dale, but what they gained was not closure. It was the opening of a darker, more painful chapter that demanded answers. The discovery of Dale Hoffman's truck in the quarry did more than end a 20-year mystery. It opened a door to secrets that no one in the family, or even the community, had been prepared to face. Once the vehicle was hoisted from the cold stone water and examined, investigators realized this was not just a case of a man gone missing. It was a crime layered with deception, betrayal, and financial desperation. Inside the cab, search teams found items preserved by the airtight compartments Dale had meticulously kept. Among them was a waterproof laptop bag, tucked beneath the passenger seat, and a stack of files that appeared to be financial records. The documents told a story of mounting debts and late payments, not from Dale, but from someone closely connected to him. Investigators began to trace the web of numbers, and a name kept surfacing: Carl Briggs. Carl wasn't a stranger. He had once been a friend, a fellow driver, who shared long stretches of highway with Dale. But beneath the surface, Carl's life was unraveling. He was drowning in debts to both banks and people far less forgiving. As detectives pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Carl had both motive and opportunity. Dale's insurance payout, and possibly his trucking contracts, could have offered Carl the financial relief he desperately needed. The receipt found in Dale's cab added another layer of intrigue. Dated the very night Dale disappeared, it showed 2 cups of coffee and 2 sandwiches purchased at the Texaco, where Dale had last been seen. For Emma, that small slip of paper was heartbreaking evidence. Her father had not been alone when he left that station. Someone had been in the truck with him, sharing a quiet meal before his final drive. That receipt became the linchpin of the investigation, pointing directly toward Carl Briggs. Detectives revisited Carl, who had long since moved on with his life, remarried, and attempted to bury his past. But the financial records uncovered in Dale's truck painted a damning picture. Large sums of money had shifted in suspicious ways around the time of Dale's disappearance, and Carl's signature appeared more than once in the paperwork Dale had been carrying. It looked less like coincidence and more like conspiracy. Neighbors recalled how, in the weeks before Dale vanished, Carl had grown erratic, showing up unannounced and pressing Dale about business opportunities. Investigators theorized that Dale had discovered something, either fraud or theft, that threatened to expose Carl. Silencing him would not only eliminate the risk, but also free Carl from crushing obligations. For the Hoffman family, each revelation cut deeper than the last. The mystery was no longer about why Dale left, but about who had taken him away. Carl Briggs, once trusted enough to share miles of highway and cups of diner coffee, was now the central figure in a murder investigation. The case that began as a disappearance was now reclassified homicide. And with every new piece of evidence, the story of Dale Hoffman shifted from tragedy to betrayal, leaving his family to grapple not only with loss, but with the knowledge that it came at the hands of someone he once called a friend. For 2 decades, the silence around Dale Hoffman's disappearance had been deafening. But when the truck was pulled from the quarry and the investigation reopened, that silence began to crack. The real breakthrough didn't come from a hidden document or a stray fingerprint. It came from a voice, one that had been quiet for far too long. Dolores Briggs, Carl's wife, had carried a secret that weighed on her every single day since that night in 1992. She was younger then, loyal to a husband who was already unraveling under the burden of debt and poor choices. For years, she convinced herself that silence was survival. But as investigators started knocking again, asking questions she had buried, the dam finally broke. Dolores told detectives what she remembered. Carl coming home late that night, his clothes streaked with mud, his boots leaving wet prints across the linoleum floor. He looked shaken, restless, pacing the living room without explanation. She pressed him for answers, but Carl brushed her off, muttering something about handling business. Her testimony shifted the entire case. It was the missing puzzle piece that investigators needed to tighten the noose. Carl Briggs could no longer hide behind speculation or coincidence. When confronted with Dolores's account and the financial records recovered from Dale's truck, Carl's facade cracked. Detectives described the moment as chilling. His shoulders slumped, his voice dropped, and the defiance drained from his eyes. With nowhere left to turn, Carl confessed. The confession was not dramatic or emotional, it was weary, almost mechanical, as though he had been rehearsing it in his head for years. Carl admitted that he had lured Dale into a confrontation under the pretense of sorting out financial disputes. The meeting had turned tense, and in a moment of fear mixed with desperation, Carl pulled the trigger. He claimed it wasn't planned, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The receipt for 2 coffees and sandwiches proved they had sat together before the murder, and the bullet found in Dale's skull showed execution rather than accident. When Carl was arrested, investigators seized several boxes from his garage, old storage containers that looked ordinary from the outside but were filled with damning evidence. Inside were financial ledgers, scraps of correspondence, and even a small collection of cassette tapes Carl had used to record conversations. Among them was one that stunned everyone, a tape capturing Dale's final moments, muffled but unmistakable, as he pleaded for reason before the fatal shot rang out. That cassette became the darkest artifact of the entire case, a haunting time capsule of betrayal. For Dale's family, hearing about the tape was almost unbearable. Emma refused to listen, saying she wanted to remember her father's voice from childhood, not from his last terrified breaths. Linda, Dale's widow, broke down when detectives explained its contents, torn between relief that the truth had surfaced and anguish over the brutality of it. Carl's confession sealed the narrative, but it also exposed the hollow heart of betrayal. This was no random act of violence on the road. It was the calculated decision of a man Dale once trusted as a friend. The revelations didn't bring Dale back, but they ensured his story would no longer be silenced. After 20 long years, the truth had finally spoken, and Carl Briggs would face justice for the crime he thought would stay buried forever. When Carl Briggs finally confessed, many believed the case had reached its conclusion. Dale Hoffman had been murdered, his body hidden, and his so-called friend had pulled the trigger. But as investigators dug deeper, it became clear that Dale's death wasn't just the tragic result of a financial dispute. It was part of something larger, darker, and far more dangerous. A conspiracy that reached beyond small-town rivalries and into the shadowy world of organized crime. The name Roy kept surfacing in financial records recovered from Dale's truck. He wasn't a trucker or a family friend. Roy was tied to construction contracts in 3 neighboring states, a man who made his money moving more than bricks and steel. Investigators soon learned that he and his partner, Tony, were not just businessmen, they were middlemen for an entire network that used trucking companies as a front for smuggling. To them, Dale Hoffman wasn't just a man with a family, he was a potential liability. At the center of that web was Jack Morrison, a construction magnate with polished shoes and political connections. On the surface, Morrison ran a legitimate business empire, but behind the curtain, his network was trafficking narcotics across state lines, using cement shipments and heavy equipment deliveries as cover. Dale's truck routes had crossed paths with Morrison's shipments more than once, and the ledgers in Carl's garage revealed payments that connected Carl directly to Morrison's men. The more detectives pulled on the thread, the more they saw how tightly the conspiracy was woven into the community. Witnesses who could place Roy or Tony at key locations suddenly grew silent. Some received anonymous calls late at night. Others found threatening notes slipped under their doors. Even Emma, Dale's daughter, wasn't spared. She recalled a black sedan parked outside her home for weeks after the investigation reopened. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia, but when her tires were slashed one morning, she understood the message. Stop asking questions. Law enforcement realized they were no longer just solving a cold case. They were stepping into a hornet's nest of corruption, money laundering, and intimidation tactics designed to silence anyone who got too close. Files were lost. Evidence went missing from local storage. More than once, officers were warned by higher authorities to back down. It became clear that Dale's murder had been a message, not just a crime of desperation. He had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and eliminating him was cheaper than risking exposure. For Dale's family, the revelation was gut-wrenching. Carl's betrayal was bad enough, but realizing that their father and husband had been swept into a world of greed and violence much bigger than him was crushing. Emma admitted that for the first time, she feared not only for justice, but for her own safety. Linda, still carrying the grief of widowhood, described it as living inside a nightmare where the villains weren't just neighbors, they were untouchable men in suits. The conspiracy left scars on the community too. Small-town trust eroded as people whispered about which businesses were clean and which weren't. The Hoffman case had started as a mystery about one man's disappearance. But the deeper truth revealed something chilling. Dale Hoffman wasn't simply a victim of betrayal. He was collateral damage in a machine built on power, smuggling, and silence. And even as Carl sat behind bars, the bigger players, the men who had orchestrated the cover-ups, still walked free. For years, Dale Hoffman's disappearance had been nothing more than a painful mystery. His family carried the unanswered questions like stones in their pockets, heavy and unshakable. But once the truth began to unravel, it set in motion something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. The case that started with a missing trucker in a small Midwestern town eventually reached the desks of the FBI, who quickly realized they weren't just dealing with a single murder. They had stumbled into the framework of a criminal network that had been hiding in plain sight. The FBI launched a sweeping investigation, pulling together local law enforcement, state police, and federal agents to map out every connection between Carl Briggs, Roy, Tony Castellano, and Jack Morrison. Bank accounts were frozen, warehouses raided, and shell companies dismantled. For decades, Morrison's trucking and construction empire had been a polished mask hiding a smuggling operation that ran narcotics and laundered millions of dollars through seemingly legitimate businesses. Now, that empire was crumbling piece by piece. Carl Briggs, who had once tried to frame his crime as an act of desperation, found himself at the center of a storm. In court, his demeanor shifted from defiance to resignation as prosecutors laid out the evidence, the financial ledgers, the ballistic reports, and the taped conversations that tied him directly to Dale's murder. He avoided the death penalty by cooperating, but there was no mercy in the sentence. Life in prison, without parole. The man who had betrayed his friend would live out his days in a cell, haunted by the choices that had destroyed not only Dale's family, but his own. But the most dramatic turn came from Tony Castellano. Known for years as Morrison's right-hand man, Tony stunned prosecutors when he chose to talk. Facing his own long sentence, he gave up everything: names, dates, routes, and even the identities of men who had carried out contract killings for the organization. His confession revealed that Dale Hoffman was not the only victim. At least 6 other truck drivers, men who had stumbled onto suspicious shipments or asked too many questions, had quietly disappeared over the years. What had once looked like isolated tragedies were now exposed as pieces of a much larger pattern of violence designed to protect Morrison's empire. For the Hoffman family, these revelations were both devastating and liberating. The horror of knowing Dale was not alone in his fate deepened their grief, but there was also a sense of vindication in seeing the truth brought into the light. Emma, now an adult with her own family, described the moment of sentencing as the first time I could breathe in 20 years. Her mother, Linda, though scarred by the decades of loss, finally had an answer to the question that had haunted her nights: why Dale never came home. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it brought a measure of closure. The FBI's crackdown dismantled Morrison's network, scattering his influence and freeing countless communities from his grip. For Emma and Linda, it meant the nightmare was no longer an open wound, and for the wider world, the Hoffman case became a chilling reminder of how one man's disappearance could expose an empire of corruption, and how even the most carefully guarded secrets eventually find their way to the surface. Emma had lived most of her life believing her father had walked away. That quiet wound shaped her childhood, her choices, and the way she saw the world. But the truth, when it finally came to light, revealed something far different. Dale Hoffman had not abandoned his family. He had died protecting them, caught in the shadow of forces bigger than he could ever have imagined. And in the end, even from beyond the grave, he left behind a voice that could not be silenced. The cassette tape discovered among the evidence carried Dale's final testimony. His words were worn with static, but the message was clear: love for his family, fear for their safety, and an unshakable determination to do what was right, no matter the cost. It was not just a recording. It was his final act of courage, a bridge between the man he was and the daughter who had carried his absence like a burden for decades. Now, as Emma prepares to bring a child of her own into the world, the weight of the past feels different. The story of Dale Hoffman does not end in tragedy alone. It extends into a new generation, one built on resilience, truth, and the unbreakable bond of family. His legacy is no longer silence. It is a reminder that justice, though slow, does arrive, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise. If stories like this move you, join us by subscribing. More tales of mystery, justice, and human resilience await.